You're listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast.
You're listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast. My name is Sean Wilkie, and along with my awesome co-host, we interview the innovators in this space every week. Ivan, please get us started.
Hey, I'm Ivan Zach, and I'm excited to introduce you to Todd Sion. Todd is the president and CEO of Akston, a biotechnology company pioneering long-acting therapeutics for companion animals. A chemical engineer by training, Todd previously founded Smart Cells, where he led the development of the first ever clinically tested glucose-responsive insulin acquired by Merck in one of the largest preclinical acquisitions of its time. He has over 2 decades of experience in protein engineering and drug delivery, and since founding Akston in 2011, fully pivoting from animal health in 2024, he has focused on bringing human-grade innovation into animal health, developing therapies that are longer lasting, easier to manufacture, and better for pets and the people who love them. Todd, welcome to the show. Thank you for finding the time.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
So you have a very exciting career in both vet space and just in general. Can you tell us a little bit more about sort of origin of Akston, how it came about, and why are we here today?
Sure. Yeah, you mentioned in the introduction, but going all the way back to my PhD days at MIT, I actually started a company called Smart Cells and licensed the technology that I was working on at MIT into the company. And that was to develop what we call the smart insulin for treating diabetes. And this was all in human health. The idea is that people who take insulin to treat their disease, they oftentimes will err on the side of taking too little because they don't want to overdose and cause hypoglycemia. And obviously, if you do take too much, that can be a problem. So we kind of got into this idea of engineering insulin so that it could actually react to the body when it was needed. And lots of ups and downs, but that was ultimately acquired by Merck in 2010. We were too young to retire, had too many ideas, decided to start Akston. And really, for most of its history, was just getting back into this idea of making proteins better medicines for treating health, and specifically in human health. Along that road, we got to a point where we had designed a long-acting insulin, something that could actually last once a week with an injection. And it was that time that we kind of recognized, well, wait a minute, dogs and cats get diabetes too, and their owners have to treat them with insulin twice a day. Could we think about developing a version of this or versions of it for dogs and cats and have that sort of be a stepping stone for risk reduction and for their development? And that's really what kicked off kind of our exploration into veterinary health, and that was back in 2019 or so.
So, Todd, bring us up to current day. So 2019 to today, lots has happened, including a global pandemic. How's the company going? Where are you guys at today, and how close are you to helping these pets and the people that own them?
Yeah, so obviously COVID came in, and we actually threw our hat in the ring and had used our technology to develop a temperature-stable vaccine for COVID, which was actually ended up getting through phase 3 clinical trials. And this was kind of meant for more of the developing world. And that was kind of what paid the bills from 2020 to 2022 or so. And then, interestingly enough, we decided, hey, there's really some opportunities here in animal health in general. And so we kind of developed this platform for making the proteins last longer. And now there's opportunities in cancer, dermatitis, chronic pain, obesity, if you can imagine. So like an Ozempic for pets. And those kind of all started coming online in 2022, 2023. And so today, our partner on the insulin programs acquired those programs in 2024. And so now we have this really great platform, and we're developing it in all these different areas. So yeah, it's been a full pivot since 2024.
It's incredible. It reminds me a long time ago when I graduated from vet school, one of my classmates was from Malibu, and he wanted to start a liposuction clinic for pets. And I fully thought that that's probably the place where it could be successful. Well, you go for it, buddy. So he maybe is competing with your Ozempic for pets. But so what are those products that you're working on? What is the most exciting thing that gets you up in the morning and you're excited to develop further?
Well, yeah. So, in the field of human medicine, monoclonal antibody therapy has become the way to go for targeted disease treatment or prevention. And I'm sure you've heard of all the different brand names, Keytruda, Humira, and others that are out there. It turns out that they're actually only just now breaking into the veterinary space. There's Librela and Solensia, which treat dermatitis in dogs and cats respectively, and there's Cytopoint that treats dermatitis. The big problem with antibodies when they're applied to veterinary health is, first of all, they're expensive. Second of all, they're actually fairly complicated to manufacture. And the other thing is they're dosed by body weight. So if you got a really big dog, it tends to cost a lot more to treat that dog than smaller ones. And they really do require a lot of manufacturing investment. So we've developed a platform, actually riffing off of what we did in the early days with COVID, to try to develop these antibodies within the animals themselves with a very small amount of material derived from our platform called Ambifect. And the idea here is that you go in now, instead of once a month to the vet, you go in once every 6 months. The animal's producing its own antibodies, so they last a lot longer. And lastly, there's such a small amount of material required that you can get there with a lot lower cost and therefore open it up to a lot more folks out there. And so we have those in cancer, looking at checkpoint inhibitor therapy for bladder cancer and others. We have one for dermatitis and one for chronic pain, as I mentioned before.
Todd, I'm just going to take a step back because I think I got lost somewhere along the way, which happens all the time to me. So I apologize in advance. You said you have a platform and you currently have multiple products in that platform. Is that correct? Today?
That's correct.
In the market?
Oh, sorry. No, they're in development.
In development.
Yes, that's right.
Got it. So then the next question, the follow-on question is, when are they going to come to market?
Yeah. So the first product in bladder cancer is actually eligible for conditional approval through the USDA, and we're targeting a 2027 introduction for that. The Ambifect version, which is the one that creates the antibodies within the dogs themselves, in that particular case for canine dog cancer, that next one is available in 2029. The dermatitis would be 2030, and then chronic pain in 2031. Obviously, contingent on regulators and results and so on, but that's the kind of rollout that we're planning.
So this is a totally new world for me. So I've been in, either veterinary hospital startups or veterinary software startups. And one of the benefits that we have in the software startups in vet medicine is that there's so many minimal regulations. Like you go, even Sean can build a product and deliver it to the world, and there's no HIPAA compliance or anything else. And I'm being funny here. He developed a wonderful product. And when I built my previous startup, we just coded it, put it to market, and there's no compliance of any sort. But in the pharmaceutical world, I assume that there's far more regulations, like you said, USDA and things like that. Is it easier in vet medicine than in human in terms of the trials and what you have to prepare to launch it? What is the difference?
Yeah, we believe so. So the first thing is that it is regulated. However, one of the reasons why we chose this pivot is because the regulations are in some ways much more straightforward and certainly not as cumbersome in our opinion. So the first thing to get out of the way is that you don't really get any breaks on the manufacturing regulations. So whether they're GMPs or making them in compliance with USDA regulations, you really don't get much of a break on that. But where you do get a break is that you really only need to run one pivotal safety and efficacy study. And typically that's in less than 500 patients that produces your entire package that you submit. And this is compared to, in some diseases in humans, you might be talking about thousands, if not tens of thousands of patients when all is said and done. So that's a big advantage. But perhaps the biggest advantage has to do with the fact that you can go in to your target patient population with minimal sort of safety and manufacturing data, but not nearly as much as what would be required to do your so-called first-in-human studies in the human space. And it's there where for less than $1 million or so, we can go in and get a very good idea whether those product candidates are likely to be safe and effective before we have to make those major investments in manufacturing and those clinical trials. And that's what a really exciting aspect of veterinary health that really isn't available to human health, and one that we're taking advantage of in all these different areas.
It's so interesting because, I don't even fully understand the cycle of adoption and things like that. When I think about the software, we always talk about minimal viable product. You deliver it to the customers, they try it. After that, you're trying to iterate it until you get to the product market fit. Once you understand that this particular market fits with your product, then you can push on the pedal and, push marketing and sales and scale. In the pharmaceutical world, what is the analogy to that? Because it feels like your MVP is tried in the lab, your product market fit is discovered only after you went through all the hurdle of getting all these regulatory approvals, but then you still have to conquer the market and sell it, and it could fail at any point. So sounds like such a high risk business.
It's definitely, there is risk, but I would say that, again, in human health, you've perfectly described the situation. And I think maybe some of our woes with not having as many products approved and certainly not at affordable prices has to do with that. I think in animal health, I would say that you've got your candidates are kind of at that lab level, but your MVP can kind of be figured out in that early stage pilot study, as I was mentioning, in the target disease population. So what you're getting from that is not just safety and efficacy, but you're understanding how both the vets and the pet parents are responding to your prototype, if you will. And oftentimes you can iterate on that, but you haven't spent a ton of money getting it through all the regulations only to find out that you had some fundamental flaw, which can happen. So I would say that you still do have to eventually go through that. And yes, you are sort of at risk as to what level of market share you could get. But I think you're going into it knowing much more about those issues than you would certainly in human health.
So it sounds like there are similar phases of development of the product, but once you have, you've got your initial validation. When we develop software, just from my experience, now you have your product, the market that you're going to go after, but then there's still this, amount of capital that you need to invest to go after it. And if you have a competitor or competitor came about while you were developing, because your development cycle is pretty long as well, then what are those indicators for investors or entrepreneur like yourself? And you need to convince investors to say, hey, we're going to sell this more than the product A, because what are the indicators that they're looking for to say this is going to be successful? Let's double down on sales and marketing and go out there.
Yeah, no, this is certainly an issue. And, I think one of the things that you have to make sure of is that you have something that is clearly distinguishable in the marketplace and is likely to still be distinguishable even within 5 or 6 years. So, for example, in our case, we're targeting once every 6-month dosing, maybe even once a year. The current technologies that are out there at best could maybe get to once every 3 months. And so I think there you want to make sure that if you are able to overcome all those hurdles and get through, that you're likely to not have much competition for what you're delivering. So I think that's number one. I think number two is, and this is something that a lot of companies like ours don't do, is that we've invested in our own manufacturing. And why would you do something like that? Well, because we have a platform, all these different products are built off the same manufacturing process, unit operations, and so on. And so we can defer kind of, all that capital investment over multiple products so that we can make sure that as a portfolio, investing in the portfolio, not all of them have to succeed or not all of them have to become blockbusters in order to see a return on investment. Obviously, we'd like that to happen, but that's the case. So I think those are a couple things that have helped us bring in significant financing where maybe some other companies that are only working on one product and they're doing it as a virtual company have fallen short.
That's really fascinating. And it kind of it's a great segue to my question, which is, Todd, this is such a different world than what me and Ivan are used to. And the patience required to go from an idea to execution appears to be like a decade or at least half a decade. What have you learned as you've navigated this now 2 times for other people that might be interested in a career like yours?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So first of all, it's a lot better in animal health than it is in human health, at least in terms of timelines. So even though it still sounds daunting in veterinary health, I would say I'm feeling much better about that. I think the other thing is that you really have to have a really solid team that understands all of these risks and rewards along the way and share in that longer time horizon, if you will. I benefited with Akston because I had built a company before. And when we came to Akston, we sort of blew the conch shell and said, come on back, we've got something new. And we were able to kind of build on that team that had already been through it once. And I think that's helped us out quite a bit as we've had to pivot over the years, early on being mostly in human health, then veterinary, then COVID. And I think a lot of that does come down to the team and, the culture that's built around, this kind of risk reward scenario.
But even the team, so again, translating back into the, startup, you can be scrappy in the software startup, have yourself technical developer, and then slowly kind of bring in capital. But your team means if you said you build a platform and manufacture, like before you get to revenue or idea of revenue, what is the size of the team we're talking about? Like what is that baseline?
Yeah, so we're at about 55 employees, which for a startup is actually not insignificant. You can do the math on the burn rate associated with that. They span quality assurance, quality control, manufacturing process development, regulatory, clinical. One of the ways in which we were able to do it, and I think this is sort of thinking about advice to others, is that the first products that I mentioned, the insulin products, were actually partnered with a veterinary pharma company. So we were giving up some portion of the upside in order to get money in to, work on developing those products, but also allowing us to kind of build out the team and the infrastructure. And so I agree with you that if you were to do it all completely with investor cash, you would probably find even more difficulty. But if you can sort of offset that capital and financing risk with revenue coming in from partnerships, albeit ones that do give up some upside, I think you can find that blend. At least we've been able to do that.
So I was at the conference a couple of weeks ago in Ottawa called SAS North, and I was talking to a very inspired gentleman. He's a software developer finishing his education in the university. For someone with your background, when you were doing your PhD at MIT, and then when you probably didn't start your company, what would someone in that position, when they're finishing a robust education like that and want to become entrepreneur like yourself, what would be your advice? Which avenue to take? How to find the opportunities like you have?
Well, the first thing I'd say is certainly if it's like a graduate study program, like a PhD, you're kind of already used to living like a pauper and trying to figure out everything on your own. So I would say the best time to go into it is right after that. I think if you go out into the so-called, real world, start earning a salary, developing more roots in different places, I do think it's more difficult to take on this, at least in the field that I've chosen. So I would say it's actually a perfect time to do that. And oftentimes, depending on that sort of university environment, there may be resources there for entrepreneurship in terms of mentorship. And I know I took advantage of that at MIT. There was a wonderful venture mentoring service there that I took full advantage of. There are also oftentimes student-led organizations like business plan competitions and other things where you can kind of learn a lot about it without already launching and then having to, find your own salary. So that would be some advice I'd give for the folks that are already in that kind of environment.
Yeah, that's awesome. It makes a ton of sense. So a bit of a completely different direction. So we've got a big audience of corporate consolidators, veterinarians, all kinds of people in animal health. If they want to find out more information about your products, what you guys are up to, when they're coming out to the market, how do they do that? And it's a two-part question because the second part is there any way that we can help? Is there any way that our audience can help? And if so, here's the platform.
Sure. No, that's great. So I think the first place to go is akston.com, and we've got a nice website there where you can learn more about the technology, the team, the product concepts, a little bit more into the technology. There's some nice functional videos on there to show how these things, actually work in the body. So I would encourage that. LinkedIn is another place where you can get, I think, a decent amount of sort of like our recent press releases, what we're doing on a more real-time basis. And I think in terms of help, certainly the folks that are out there on the front lines of veterinary care would love to hear more about, what you think about these products, certainly the concept of getting, sort of fewer injections, fewer visits. There's one area that we know, in this area of consolidation, obviously cost reductions are important, but we don't want to sacrifice innovation and quality. And so, we think we're, helping scratch that itch, but it would be nice to know what folks think about that. And then I think the last thing is that to the extent that anyone out there has been involved in clinical studies for registration out there, especially those outside of the academic institutions but are out in the practicing clinics, would love to hear from you, because as we go through this pipeline, we're going to be running studies and we're going to need multiple sites, and we'd love to have folks volunteer to be one of those sites for us.
Very, very interesting episode, and we're running out of time as we usually do. Todd, 2 questions we ask at the end of every episode. One is their book, TED Talk, YouTube video, anything that inspired you recently that you would like to share with the audience.
Well, yeah, I've got an audiobook that I'm just about finishing now called Zubiquity, and it's a really interesting one where, it's kind of, we've come full circle on using what we've learned about animals and trying to inform human health. And it's a really interesting collection of sort of how one can apply learning from not just domesticated animals, but also wild animals, and understanding more about human health. So I would certainly recommend that to folks out there.
Amazing. And the last question we've got for you today is another innovator in the space that you think would be a great guest for our show.
Well, someone who I meet regularly at all the conferences, Eve Hanks, she's the founder of myRNA, and Eve is developing basically microRNA testing where you can get very low cost, high accuracy diagnosis for pets of all sorts of conditions, and she's doing a great job. She's venture backed, and it's pretty exciting work.
Thank you so much for listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast. If you want to hear about our new episodes, please follow us on any social media channel. Also, you can check out our website at veterinarynnovationpodcast.com. See you next week.